The city stretched beneath him like a living thing, breathing light and shadow through its veins of glass and steel. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the Mafia boss watched it all in silence. The ports he controlled, the roads his trucks ruled after midnight, the politicians who pretended not to know his name while answering his calls within seconds. This city did not belong to the mayor, the police chief, or the billionaires who smiled for magazines. It belonged to him, and everyone who mattered knew it. He stood perfectly still, hands resting loosely behind his back, posture calm in a way that made men nervous. Power did not announce itself in him. It settled, it lingered, it waited. At 38, he had already survived betrayals that would have ended dynasties. Rival families spoke his name carefully, as if saying it too loudly might draw his attention. They called him ruthless, untouchable, inevitable, a man who never raised his voice and never made the same mistake twice. His penthouse was not decorated for comfort, no excess, no softness. Stone floors, dark wood, restrained luxury chosen not to impress but to remind. Every object had a purpose, every angle allowed him to see without being seen. Even here, at the highest point of the building, he lived like a man under siege. Security cameras fed quietly into a wall of screens behind him. Guards rotated silently beyond reinforced doors. Nothing moved without his permission. Nothing existed outside his awareness. And yet, in the vast silence of the room, something felt hollow. The loyalty that surrounded him was loud but empty. Men bowed because they were afraid, they smiled because survival required it. Alliances were formed with shaking hands and broken the moment weakness appeared. He had learned early that trust was a luxury reserved for the dead. His rule had been built on discipline, restraint, and a reputation for ending threats before they matured. He did not enjoy violence, he simply understood it. To him, cruelty was inefficient, precision was everything. From this height, the city looked obedient, small, controllable, but power had a way of isolating those who held it longest. Conversations around him were always filtered, curated, calculated. No one spoke honestly unless invited. No one challenged him unless they wanted to disappear. Laughter in his presence sounded rehearsed. Admiration felt transactional. Even respect came with an invisible price tag. He exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the skyline as if searching for something he could not name. Success had not brought peace, it had brought distance. He had everything men killed for and nothing that truly reached him, not anymore. Below, the city buzzed with rumors. Whispers moved through private clubs and back rooms, passed between rival underbosses and polished donors who lived double lives. An elite ball was coming. Officially, it was a charity event. Unofficially, it was a reckoning, a place where alliances would be tested under chandeliers and silk, where enemies would smile while counting exits, where the balance of power could shift with a single misstep. Attendance was not optional for men like him. Absence would be read as weakness. Presence would invite scrutiny. He had attended dozens of such gatherings over the years, always with the same type of woman on his arm. Beautiful, expensive, interchangeable, they understood the rules: smile, say little, reveal nothing. Trophies that reinforced his image without touching his life. Afterward, they disappeared quietly, paid well, remembered vaguely. This time felt different. The thought came uninvited, settling in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. He did not yet know why, only that something about the upcoming ball disturbed his usual certainty. The alliances felt more fragile, the rival families bolder. There were new players watching, measuring him, waiting for a crack. He could sense it the way predators sensed weather changes before a storm. For the first time in years, he was considering a move that had nothing to do with fear or dominance. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, controlled, unreadable, alone. He wondered, not for the first time, when power had stopped feeling like victory and started feeling like a cage, when ruling the city had begun to cost him something he could not buy back. Beneath the reputation, beneath the whispered legends, there was a man standing at the edge of his empire, quietly dissatisfied with the emptiness of unquestioned loyalty. And somewhere deep inside, a decision was forming, one that would unsettle his enemies, confuse his allies, and expose him in ways no rival ever had. The city below continued to glitter, unaware that its silent king was planning something that would change the rules of the game. The invitation came without ceremony, yet it carried weight that pressed against the walls of the penthouse long after it was spoken. The ball was not announced publicly, it never was. It moved through the city like a quiet current whispered between men who understood that attendance meant survival and absence meant erasure. It would be held in a restored opera house overlooking the harbor, a place soaked in old power and newer blood, where crystal chandeliers hid surveillance cameras and every smile was a negotiation. The Mafia boss read the details once, then set the card down slowly, his expression unchanged, while something sharp and restless stirred beneath his control. This ball was different. Alliances were fragile and rival families were arriving with intentions disguised as courtesy. Everyone would be watching him, waiting to see which woman stood at his side, because in their world a companion was never just a companion, she was a message. Normally the choice would have been effortless, a socialite trained to say nothing and reflect everything, someone polished enough to look impressive and empty enough to remain harmless. His associates expected it, his enemies counted on it. Yet when his chief lieutenant casually suggested a name over a secure call, the Mafia boss felt an unexpected resistance rise in him, subtle but firm. He ended the call early and stood alone in the quiet office, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of dissatisfaction. The women they offered all belonged to the same hollow circle, people who smiled because they wanted something, people who saw him as a ladder rather than a man. Taking one of them would change nothing, it would reassure the vultures that he was predictable, untouched, unchanged. His gaze drifted instead to the glass wall separating his office from the outer workspace, where his assistant sat surrounded by screens and files, calm as always, her presence steady in a world that thrived on chaos. She moved with purpose, not fear, spoke when necessary, and never wasted words. She knew his schedules, his enemies, his habits, and his silences. She had seen the machinery of his empire up close and never flinched. More importantly, she had never asked him for anything that was not earned. The realization settled slowly and dangerously. Taking her to the ball would be unthinkable to his world, and that was exactly why it mattered. When he called her in, she entered with the same composed professionalism she always carried, unaware that the balance of power in the room had already shifted. He studied her carefully, noting the way she listened rather than waited to speak, the way her eyes held intelligence without calculation. He spoke of the ball casually at first, explaining its significance, its risks, its expectations. Then he said her name and asked if she would attend with him. Not ordered, not implied, asked. The silence that followed was charged and heavy. She did not respond immediately, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it with control. She understood what this meant, the scrutiny, the danger, the judgment. She also understood what it would say to the city. Outside the office walls, whispers were already forming. His inner circle noticed the delay in his usual arrangements. Rivals sensed hesitation where there had never been any. Rumors spread that the king of the city was planning something unconventional. Some laughed quietly, others grew uneasy. An unexpected move from a man like him was never a coincidence, it was either a trap or a declaration. The upcoming ball began to feel less like a social event and more like a battlefield dressed in velvet. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but careful. She asked what role he expected her to play, and he answered honestly, not a shield, not a symbol, simply herself. That honesty unsettled her more than any command could have. She did not agree immediately. She asked for time, and he granted it without resistance. As she left the room, the Mafia boss remained standing, aware that he had crossed an invisible line. For the first time in years, he had made a decision not based on fear or dominance, but on instinct, and instincts in his world were dangerous things. Somewhere in the city, men were already sharpening their smiles and preparing their judgments. They would mock him for this choice, underestimate her because of it, and believe they were safe. None of them yet understood that this invitation was not weakness. It was the opening move of a game that would expose every false alliance in the room and change who truly held power when the lights finally dimmed. The laughter did not reach his ears directly, it reached him the way smoke does through walls, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It moved through private lounges and encrypted calls carried by men who believed power belonged only to those born into it. His longtime allies spoke his name with disbelief and amusement, questioning not his strength but his judgment. They said he had finally grown careless, that isolation had dulled his instincts, that bringing an assistant to a ball meant sentiment had infected strategy. Some laughed openly, others smiled behind their hands, but all of them watched closely because mockery was only safe until proven wrong. They gathered without him in a private club overlooking the harbor, a place where deals were sealed with expensive drinks and unspoken threats. Velvet chairs and low lighting could not hide the sharpness in their voices. One man called it a joke, said the assistant would fold under pressure. Another said she would be eaten alive by senators and rival families before dessert was served. They spoke of her as if she were an object misplaced in a room that did not belong to her. None of them considered that the man who ruled the city did nothing without calculation. Arrogance made them comfortable, and comfort made them blind. The rumors reached deeper than mockery, they became warnings dressed as concern. Messages were sent to him, carefully worded, suggesting alternative companions, reminding him of tradition and image. They said the ball was not a place for experiments, that enemies would interpret the choice as weakness, that bringing her would paint a target on her back. They framed it as loyalty, as advice, as friendship. But beneath every word was fear of unpredictability, fear of losing control of the familiar order. The man who had never broken pattern before was about to shatter it, and they did not know where the pieces would fall. Inside the penthouse, the assistant felt the shift long before anyone spoke to her directly. The atmosphere changed in subtle ways, glances lingered, conversations paused when she entered rooms, security tightened without explanation. She did not need confirmation to understand that she was being discussed, measured, dismissed. She had lived long enough on the edges of power to recognize judgment when it sharpened its teeth. Still, she said nothing, asked nothing, continued her work with the same precision as always. Outward calm was not weakness, it was armor. Late that evening, as the city lights reflected off the glass, she overheard fragments of a call not meant for her ears. Her name spoken without respect, without curiosity, reduced to a risk, a mistake, a liability. Something cold settled in her chest, not fear but clarity. She understood then that this was not simply about attending a ball, it was about standing in a world that did not believe she deserved to exist within it. The realization did not break her, it hardened her resolve. She would not beg for acceptance or retreat into invisibility. Above them all, the Mafia boss listened to reports with an expression that revealed nothing. Every mocking word was catalogued, every warning noted. He did not correct them, did not defend himself publicly. Silence was his weapon and anticipation his ally. What they mistook for blindness was patience. What they called foolishness was intention. He knew this choice would provoke them, and that was precisely the point. Loyalty built on fear deserved to be tested, and alliances that cracked under discomfort deserved to fall. As the night deepened, the city buzzed with speculation, unaware that the laughter echoing through private rooms would soon turn into stunned silence. They believed they were watching a powerful man make a sentimental mistake. None of them realized they were witnessing the first tremor of an earthquake that would expose every false throne in the room. She prepared in silence, the kind that settles deep and steady rather than loud and dramatic. While the city whispered and judged, she moved through her small apartment with deliberate calm, folding away the noise of other people's opinions as if they were clothes she no longer wore. She did not call friends for reassurance or search mirrors for approval. She understood something the men laughing in private rooms did not understand, yet that survival in powerful worlds belonged to those who did not ask permission to exist. The invitation lay on her table not as a symbol of luxury but as a challenge. She read it again, slowly memorizing every detail, not because she needed to, but because preparation had always been her form of defense. The ball was not about gowns or chandeliers, it was about presence and perception, and danger disguised as elegance. She knew the rules even if she had never stood in the center of that room before. Listen more than speak, observe more than react, never reveal fear, and never mistake politeness for safety. She chose her dress without hesitation, not something loud, not something borrowed from status she did not claim. It came from a different place, one rooted in memory and dignity. A dress altered carefully by her own hands, carrying no designer name but carrying weight all the same. It reminded her of where she came from, of nights when strength mattered more than recognition. She was not dressing to impress them, she was dressing to represent herself, and that distinction mattered. As she prepared, she thought of the man who had asked rather than commanded. She understood the risk he was taking by bringing her, and she respected it without romanticizing it. Power like his did not bend easily, and when it did, it was always noticed. She also understood that once she stepped into that room, she would be standing not behind him, but beside him, and that choice carried consequences neither of them could fully predict. Fear whispered that she did not belong there, but experience answered calmly that belonging was not granted, it was taken. Outside her window, the city glowed restless and watchful. Somewhere men were already rehearsing their smirks, convinced she would falter, convinced she would confirm every shallow assumption they had ever made about women who worked quietly in the shadows. She welcomed that expectation the way a strategist welcomes an enemy who underestimates them. There was power in being unseen, and she had mastered it long before this night. She reviewed the guest list again, not with awe but with calculation, recognizing names tied to influence, violence, money, and fragile egos. She knew who would test her and who would ignore her, and who would pretend kindness while measuring weakness. She also knew something else, something they did not, that the city had been shaped quietly by unseen hands for years, and many of those hands had been hers. Logistics rerouted crises, softened conflicts, delayed violence disguised as efficiency. No one had thanked her for it, and she had never needed them to. As the evening approached, a strange calm settled over her, not the calm of surrender but the calm of readiness. She understood that walking into that ballroom would be like stepping onto a narrow bridge suspended over judgment and danger. One misstep and she would fall, but she trusted her balance. She trusted the discipline built over years of standing near power without being consumed by it. When she finally closed the door behind her, she did not look back. Whatever waited inside that grand room would not define her worth. She would enter not as an accessory, not as a mistake, but as a presence. And whether they welcomed her or sharpened their knives, she would meet them with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. The night opened its jaws as the car slowed before the opera house, and the city seemed to hold its breath in recognition. Light spilled across marble steps and polished stone, while cameras flashed like distant lightning, capturing faces that mattered and some that only pretended to. The Mafia boss stepped out first, his presence commanding the space without effort, the way gravity commands falling things. Murmurs rippled instantly through the crowd, recognition mixed with caution, because when he arrived, history tended to follow. Then he turned and offered his hand, not as a signal of ownership but as an invitation, and that was when the air shifted. She stepped out beside him with a calm that cut through the noise sharper than any weapon. The fabric of her dress caught the light softly, not demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. There was nothing loud about her beauty, nothing rehearsed or desperate, and that unsettled them more than excess ever could. Whispers stumbled over themselves as eyes narrowed and widened in confusion, because this was not the woman they had prepared to judge. This was not an accessory or a mistake. This was composure walking on marble. The mocking smiles froze halfway into place. Conversations faltered. A silence spread in uneven waves as people realized something had gone wrong with their expectations. They had anticipated awkwardness, hesitation, weakness, something to confirm their certainty. Instead, they were met with presence. She did not cling to his arm, nor did she trail behind him. She moved beside him as if the room had always been hers to enter. Each step was unhurried, each breath steady, and in that stillness, the judgment in the room began to fracture. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers glowed like constellations trapped in crystal and velvet, draped the walls in indulgence. Powerful men and women turned openly, now forgetting discretion because curiosity burned hotter than caution. Some searched her face for origins, others for cracks, none found either. She met their stares without challenge or apology, simply acknowledging their existence without granting it importance. The Mafia boss felt it then, a shift not just in the room but in himself, a rare unfamiliar pride rising quietly as he watched the city reassess what it thought it understood. His rivals exchanged glances, their amusement replaced by calculation. A few leaned closer, whispering reassessments, already rewriting narratives they had laughed about hours earlier. Someone near the bar fell silent mid-sentence, realizing that she was listening and that her attention carried weight. Another recognized her from meetings they had underestimated, from reports they had skimmed without reading the signature. Recognition dawned slowly, and with it discomfort. As they moved deeper into the room, the whispers grew more urgent. Who is she? How does she walk like that? Why does she look unafraid? The questions piled up unanswered, and that uncertainty gnawed at egos built on certainty. The assistant felt it all, the tension, curiosity, threat, admiration, and dismissal swirling together, but she remained centered. She had known this moment would come. The instant judgment met reality, and she was ready for it. Somewhere near the edge of the room, one of the men who had laughed loudest earlier swallowed hard. This was not the spectacle he had anticipated. This was not a woman about to be exposed. This was a woman who had arrived already knowing who she was, and that realization spread like a quiet shock through the elite gathered there. By the time they reached the center of the ballroom, the balance had already shifted. Nothing had been said, yet everything had changed. The city was watching, and for the first time that night, the laughter had vanished, completely replaced by the heavy, unsettling silence of people realizing they may have underestimated the wrong person. The room began to move differently around her, as if the air itself had decided to pay attention. Conversations that once flowed around power now angled toward her without intention, revealing curiosity that could no longer be contained. A senator leaned closer, asking about trade routes disguised as philanthropy, and she answered without hesitation, her words precise, measured, and unexpectedly insightful. A rival family representative attempted charm, then subtle intimidation, and she met both with calm clarity, acknowledging neither as superior. Each exchange shifted the weight of the room slightly, until what had felt solid now felt uncertain. She spoke when spoken to, never rushing, never shrinking, and people began to notice how often the Mafia boss watched her instead of the crowd. Not protectively, not possessively, but with something closer to recognition. He had commanded rooms for decades, yet tonight he felt something new unfolding, a quiet reversal where authority did not need to speak to be understood. The men who once believed they carried influence realized she knew their weaknesses without having to name them. She referenced initiatives, supply chains, humanitarian corridors, and compliance frameworks that only insiders understood, and did so without arrogance. Knowledge became her currency, and it bought silence from those who had planned to test her. A glass paused halfway to a mouth when someone recognized her voice from past calls that had settled disputes no one else could. Whispers sharpened again, this time with urgency rather than amusement. How did she know so much? Why was she so composed? Why did the boss trust her with this access? Questions layered over each other, creating tension that wrapped the ballroom tighter with every minute. The orchestra continued to play, but the real rhythm now belonged to the subtle recalibration of power unfolding in real time. The Mafia boss felt it like a tide pulling away from old ground. His allies adjusted their posture, unconsciously standing straighter, speaking more carefully as if unsure of which rules still applied. Enemies softened their tone, testing for leverage and finding none. For years they had measured him by violence, reputation, and fear, yet here was something far more unsettling to them, a woman who carried authority without threat and whose presence suggested strategy beyond bloodshed. He realized then that bringing her here had not exposed weakness, it had revealed depth. She moved through the room as if mapping it, filing away reactions, alliances, fractures. When a prominent donor attempted to dismiss her contributions, she responded with quiet facts outlining outcomes that had saved both money and lives, leaving no space for rebuttal. Applause did not follow, but respect did, and it was heavier, more permanent. One by one assumptions collapsed, replaced by reluctant admiration. The mocking laughter from earlier now felt like a distant embarrassment no one wanted to claim ownership of. Near the edge of the ballroom, a rival patriarch watched her closely, his expression dark with calculation. He saw not beauty but danger, not vulnerability but disruption. This was not a woman to be controlled or ignored. This was a force that could rewrite how power operated in the city. He understood that the Mafia boss had not brought her as decoration, he had brought her as a signal, and the message was clear: the rules were changing. As the evening deepened, the realization settled across the elite like an uncomfortable truth. The assistant they had mocked was no longer invisible. She had become the axis around which conversations now turned. And the man who owned the city stood beside her, silently knowing that the balance of power had already shifted without a single threat being made. The confrontation arrived without announcement, sliding into the room on polished shoes and practiced confidence. A rival patriarch stepped forward from the edge of the ballroom, his presence drawing attention the way storms draw birds into silence. He smiled thinly and addressed her directly, not the Mafia boss, not the circle of power, but her. The question he posed sounded courteous on the surface, yet everyone felt the blade beneath it. He asked what qualified her to stand there among men who had paid in blood and years for their influence. The music softened as if the orchestra sensed danger, and the room leaned inward, waiting for the expected reaction. This was the moment they had anticipated: the crack, the hesitation, the glance toward the man beside her. Some expected him to intervene violently, others waited for embarrassment to bloom. Instead, she took a single breath and met the rival's gaze without flinching. Her voice carried evenly across the space, not raised, not defensive. She spoke of responsibility rather than rank, of outcomes rather than legacy. She explained that influence meant nothing if it could not protect what mattered, and that power without purpose rotted from the inside. Each word landed with quiet force, exposing the emptiness behind inherited authority. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as recognition sparked. She referenced decisions made in rooms most had forgotten and compromises that had prevented wars no one had known were coming. She spoke of corridors opened for aid, routes stabilized, and families spared retaliation not by mercy alone but by strategy. Faces shifted as people realized they had benefited from her work without ever learning her name. The rival patriarch's smile faltered as his certainty eroded in front of witnesses he could not control. The Mafia boss remained silent, watching with an intensity that surprised even himself. This was not protection unfolding, this was revelation. He felt the weight of the room tilt as men recalculated alliances and women reassessed loyalties. Fear did not dominate the moment, truth did, and truth was far more dangerous. The rival attempted to reclaim ground by questioning her authority, but she did not engage the provocation. She answered with clarity, stating that authority was not granted by titles, but earned through consequences lived with and carried. The simplicity of it stripped the confrontation of theater, leaving only substance. Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own past decisions had been quietly corrected by the woman they had dismissed. Another guest lowered their glass, no longer amused. The orchestra fell into near silence now, and every breath in the room seemed synchronized. When she finished speaking, she did not wait for approval. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the exchange as complete, and turned away, returning to her place beside the Mafia boss as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The rival patriarch stepped back, his challenge dissolved, his power momentarily diminished, not by threat but by exposure. The message spread instantly and unmistakably. This was not a woman who could be humiliated or intimidated. This was a strategist whose influence had already shaped the city and whose calm dismantled egos more efficiently than violence ever could. In that suspended moment, the elite understood that the balance had shifted again, and that the most dangerous person in the room was not the man who ruled the city, but the woman who had just shown them why his reign was changing. The truth did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly like a curtain pulled back by unseen hands, and the room felt it before it understood it. A philanthropist near the stage began to speak, praising initiatives that had quietly saved entire districts from collapse, and as names and timelines were mentioned, heads turned instinctively toward her. She did not react, she did not seek recognition, yet the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every success, every stabilized route, every conflict that had ended without bloodshed traced back to decisions made in silence, guided by a mind that valued outcomes over dominance. The city had been changing for years, and no one had bothered to ask who had been steering it away from ruin. Whispers rose again, but this time they carried awe rather than mockery. A senator recalled a late-night call years ago when funding mysteriously appeared just in time to prevent a public disaster. A rival family matriarch stiffened as she realized her youngest son was alive because a retaliatory order had been delayed and redirected through channels she never traced. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced, not shouted, not announced, but undeniable. The assistant they had dismissed was the architect of mercy in a world that thrived on cruelty. She had negotiated corridors disguised as logistics, adjusted supply chains to prevent wars, and created humanitarian fronts that did real work while masking fragile truces. She had done it without praise, without credit, and without ever asking permission. The Mafia boss felt the weight of it settle fully in his chest. He had known she was capable, he had trusted her instincts, but even he had not seen the full scope of what she had carried alone. She had been shaping his empire from within, bending it toward restraint, toward protection, without ever challenging his authority openly. Not manipulation, not rebellion, but partnership waiting to be acknowledged. He understood now that the reason his rule had grown quieter, more stable, was because she had been absorbing the damage, redirecting it, softening edges before they cut too deep. His power had not weakened under her influence, it had matured. Across the room, men who once boasted of brutality felt suddenly exposed. Their reputations felt small against the realization that true control had been exercised without fear or spectacle. One by one, they understood that the city they claimed to own had been spared devastation by someone they never saw coming. The rival patriarch who had challenged her earlier avoided her gaze, now his authority diminished by the awareness that his family owed her a debt he could never repay publicly. She remained still as the truth rippled outward, her composure unchanged, because she had never done the work for recognition. She had done it because someone had to. When eyes finally met hers, they found no triumph there, only resolve. The Mafia boss stepped forward, then not to claim her but to acknowledge her, and the gesture alone silenced the room. This was not a reveal engineered for drama, it was a reckoning forced by reality. The city had already chosen her long before this night, and now its rulers were only catching up. The elite stood surrounded by crystal and velvet, realizing the most powerful force in the room had never needed a throne. She had rewritten their world quietly, patiently, and irrevocably, and the final shocking truth settled into every corner of the ballroom. The assistant they had mocked was not standing beside power, she had been guiding it all along. The offer was made in a voice smooth and deliberate, carried from a circle of men who believed they still controlled the shape of the night. It was presented as opportunity, framed as respect, disguised as inevitability. A rival coalition proposed a consolidation move, one that would place the Mafia boss at the undisputed peak of the city by eliminating remaining resistance through coordinated force. Territory would expand, profits would multiply, and fear would once again become the language of order. It was everything his reputation had been built on, and everyone waited for him to accept, because that was what men like him always did when power was placed within reach. The room tightened around the moment, knowing that his answer would decide which families rose and which disappeared. Eyes flicked toward him, expecting the familiar cold agreement, the silent nod that meant blood would follow. Instead, he remained still, and in that stillness the uncertainty deepened. He looked at the faces before him, allies, rivals, opportunists, and saw only reflections of an old world he no longer wished to rule. Then he looked at her, and the decision settled fully into place, not as impulse but as clarity. He spoke calmly, rejecting the offer not with anger but with certainty, stating that consolidation through destruction weakened foundations rather than strengthening them. The words sent a shock through the room, sharper than any threat could have. Murmurs rose, disbelief rippling outward as power recalculated itself. Refusing dominance in front of witnesses was unthinkable, yet he did it without hesitation, making it clear that the path forward would be built on restraint, structure, and protection rather than fear. She felt the shift before anyone else did, sensing the way history bent in that moment. When he spoke again, he acknowledged her openly, not as an assistant, not as a shield, but as an equal voice whose vision had already proven its strength. The declaration was quiet, but its impact thundered through the ballroom. Enemies stiffened, allies faltered, and those who mocked her earlier lowered their gaze, understanding too late that they were standing on the wrong side of the future. Some attempted protest, others calculated exits, but none challenged the authority of the choice because authority no longer needed to be proven. By standing beside her rather than above her, he dismantled expectations that had governed the city for generations. Power was no longer something taken by force, it was something shared with intention. The city felt it the way it feels an approaching dawn, uncertain yet undeniable. As the music resumed hesitantly, conversations restarted in altered tones, and alliances reshaped themselves around the new reality. The Mafia boss had not lost power. By choosing her path, he had redefined it, and in doing so made it clear that anyone who wished to remain standing would have to follow a different rulebook. The night did not end with violence or applause, it ended with understanding, and that understanding was far more permanent. The city did not change overnight, it never did. Real power moved quietly, settling into new shapes without ceremony. Weeks passed, and the echoes of the ball continued to ripple through private offices, guarded rooms, and whispered meetings. Deals once built on intimidation were now approached with caution and structure. Violence did not disappear, but it retreated, choosing distance over spectacle. The streets felt different, not safer in a fragile way, but steadier, like a storm that had chosen a new direction. People who had lived under constant threat sensed it, even if they could not name it. Something fundamental had shifted, and the city was adjusting to the weight of it. She became a name spoken carefully, no longer followed by laughter but by respect. Invitations arrived, not demanding but requesting her presence. Men who once dismissed her sought her counsel in quiet corners away from prideful eyes. She listened more than she spoke, always measuring consequences before offering solutions. She never reminded anyone of the night they underestimated her because power that needed reminders was already weak. Her influence grew not because she claimed it but because it worked. Roots stabilized conflicts, softened families once caught in endless cycles of retaliation, found space to breathe. The city learned her value through results, not reputation. The Mafia boss watched this evolution with a calm that surprised even him. For the first time since claiming the city, he did not feel the constant pressure to dominate every room. Leadership no longer meant standing alone at the highest point, it meant standing beside someone who could see further than he ever had. Together they rewrote the rules, quietly replacing fear with structure, chaos with intention. Those who adapted remained, those who resisted faded into irrelevance without a single public fall. It was not mercy, it was efficiency shaped by vision. Months later, another gathering filled the same opera house, though the atmosphere carried a different energy. There were fewer cameras, fewer empty smiles, and far less pretending. She stood at the center of the room, now not elevated by title but by acknowledgement. When she spoke, the room listened not out of fear but understanding. The Mafia boss remained nearby, his presence steady, supportive, no longer the sole axis of attention. Their partnership was no secret now, and no scandal either. It had become the new foundation upon which the city balanced itself. One of the men who had mocked her first approached quietly, his posture stripped of arrogance. He did not apologize with words because words would have been hollow. Instead, he offered cooperation, resources, and silence where silence was needed. She accepted without triumph because the future mattered more than the past. Across the room, others watched and learned that night humility survived longer than pride. As the evening drew to a close, she and the Mafia boss stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city that once belonged to him alone. Lights shimmered below, familiar yet changed. He turned to her and for the first time allowed himself to say what power had never given him before, that he was not alone. She did not answer with promises or romance. She simply stood there with him, sharing the weight of what they had built. That was enough. The city continued to breathe beneath them, alive, unpredictable, and vast. It no longer bowed to a single shadow but to a balance forged in restraint and purpose. Those who once believed strength meant domination now understood that the most dangerous transformation was not loud or violent. It was quiet, deliberate, and permanent. And it had begun the moment a woman everyone ignored chose to walk into a room unafraid and be seen.